Narrative Paradigm Theory by Amy Wright Payne at California Baptist University for COM 403, Communication Theory, under the instruction of Professor Sandra Romo. USC Professor Emeritus Walter Fisher rejected the common idea that rhetoric is only a matter of evidence, facts, arguments, reason, and logic, highly expressed in courts of law, legislatures, and other deliberative bodies. Instead, he focused on his own theories. The first one we will study is narrative paradigm theory. Walter Fisher was born in Honolulu, Hawaii in 1931 and died in 2018 at the age of 87. His eulogy reads, an esteemed teacher and mentor to generations of USC Annenberg students for more than 40 years, Fisher was a prolific scholar best known for his groundbreaking research on the narrative paradigm. According to USC, Thomas Holohan believed Fisher probably most valued his creation of Chicano and African American studies programs early in his academic career and supporting the careers of women at a time when there were few in the professoriate. As we study narrative paradigm theory, or NPT, let us consider a few axioms. Fisher's worldview begins with the concept that human beings see the world as a set of stories. Each of us accepts stories that match our values and beliefs, understood as common sense. Folks claim we make rational decisions for the most part, insisting that we weigh history, culture, and perceive others with complex, nuanced views. Fisher begins his book, Human Communication as Narration, with a reference to the opening line of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, or Logos. He notes that the Greek word logos originally included story, reason, rationale, conception, discourse, thought, all forms of human communication. Plato and Aristotle, models for Fisher's earliest concepts, laid foundation that logos would begin to refer to philosophical discourse exclusively. Information from our text tells readers that rhetoric was practical speech, the secular combination of pure logic on the one hand and emotional stories that stir up passions on the other. The rational paradigm is where Fisher began his theory development. According to Fisher, in general, educators focus on the following ideas, framing a common world paradigm. First, people are essentially rational. Second, we make decisions on the basis of arguments. Third, the type of speaking situation determines the course of our argument. Fourth, rationality is determined by how much we know and how well we argue. Fifth, the world is a set of logical puzzles that we can solve through rational analysis. Fisher is convinced that the assumptions of the rational world paradigm are too limited. Thus, he creates the narrative paradigm. Fisher calls for a new conceptual framework, a paradigm shift, so to speak, so we can begin to understand human communication more fully. His narrative paradigm is built on 5 assumptions similar in form to the rational world paradigm, but quite different in content. People are essentially storytellers, is the first one. Second, we make decisions on the basis of good reasons, which vary depending upon the communication situation, media, and genre. Third, history, biography, culture, and character determine what we consider good reasons. Fourth, narrative rationality is determined by the coherence and fidelity of our stories. Finally, the world is a set of stories from which we choose and thus constantly recreate our lives. Communication theorist Howard Kaimler describes the importance of narrative theory this way. Any communication is a sharing of stories, and getting shared is perhaps the most profound function of stories. In trading our stories back and forth for inspection, agreement, disagreement, we are involved in the activity of making ourselves members of a community. Public story trade is at the heart of the social miracle about persons. Fisher defines narration as symbolic actions, words and/or deeds that have sequence and meaning for those who live, create, or interpret them. Our text aptly phrases it this way. Fisher uses the term paradigm to refer to a conceptual framework, a widely shared perceptual filter. Perception is not so much a matter of the physics of sight and sound as it is one of interpretation. Paradigm is a universal model that calls for people to view events through a common interpretive lens. We made the decisions on the basis of good reasons. In 1978, Fisher introduced the concept of good reasons, which led to his proposal of the narrative paradigm in 1984. He proposed that offering good reasons has more to do with telling a compelling story than it does with piling up evidence or constructing a tight argument. So, how do we determine good reasons? Good reasons are determined by culture, history, biography, and character. In relation to the narrative, Fisher says there are 5 concerns we have. First, the values embedded in the message. Second, the relevance of those values to decisions made. Third, the consequences of adhering to those values. Fourth, the overlap with the worldview of the audience. And fifth, conformity with what the audience members believe is an ideal basis for contact. Narrative rationality is based on narrative coherence and narrative fidelity. Fisher believes the twin tests of narrative coherence and narrative fidelity are together the measures of a story's truthfulness and humanity. Fisher says narrative probability is a story's coherence. It is determined in 3 ways: by its argumentative or structural coherence, by its material coherence, and by its characterological coherence. More on this later. The narrative coherence test involves suspicion of accounts where characters behave uncharacteristically. Our tendencies to support characters with continuity of thought, motive, and action has to do with how probable the story sounds to the hearer. Does the narrative hang together? Do the people and events portrayed appear part of one whole? Are there obvious stray attitudes, or does the narrative feel organic? Do characters behave uniformly? Narrative fidelity is the quality of a story that causes the words to strike a responsive chord in the life of the listener. A story has fidelity when it rings true with the hearer's experiences. It squares with the stories they might tell about themselves. Fisher admits that other communities are possible, narrative communal groups based on greed or power, for example. But according to our text, he maintains that when people are confronted by the better part of themselves, these less idealistic value systems won't be entirely coherent or true to their whole lives or to the life they would most like to live. Fisher believes then that the humane virtues of the ideal audience shape our logic of reasons. They help us pick which stories are reliable and trustworthy. We assign theories on a spectrum, but primarily categorize them as objective or interpretative. NPT is part of the subjective, interpretive, rhetorical, qualitative, traditional, humanist perspective. Fisher's narrative paradigm offers a fresh reworking of Aristotelian analysis. His approach is a strongly democratic one. People usually don't need specialized training or expertise to figure out if a story holds together or offers good reasons for believing it to be true. There's still a place for experts to provide information and explanation in specialized fields. But when it comes to evaluating coherence and fidelity, people with ordinary common sense are competent rhetorical critics. We do not need to be objectively trained scientists. Whether or not you are a scientist, we are all capable of this estimation. That is the beauty of NPT. Narrative paradigm theory and its influence on communication show that while initially controversial, Fisher's construction of human reasoning as narration is fundamental to research in many disciplines beyond communication, including law, political science, diplomacy, business, and even security studies. The media utilizes his theory today to judge the effectiveness of candidates or CEOs by assessing the persuasiveness and impact of their stories through his methodology. Considering the possible extensions of NPT brings us back to something we mentioned in narrative coherence: characterological coherence. Characterological coherence also explains the power of a story to propel a population into action. In critical analysis of NPT, we use the NPT example of beloved President Ronald Reagan. Fisher analyzed a group of artifacts when he studied the narrative of President Reagan. Isn't it interesting? No one focuses on his snafus. Instead, Reagan was and is called the great communicator, despite his reputation for making factual errors and inconsistencies or contradictions in some of his statements. Fisher reasoned that at first blush, Reagan's story seems to fail the tests of NPT in its fidelity to fact and soundness of form and relevance. However, Reagan's overall narrative won others over because of the strength of his story and his character. Fisher determined the president's story was rooted in individualism, the great American ideal. Reagan proved that Americans are heroic, in essence, consistently decrying, act according to our heroic nature, and our destiny is assured. Reagan's continued popularity long after his death stems from the coherence and fidelity the American public felt about his messages. One criticism of NPT is rhetoric misused. As for the concept of effective discourse versus good discourse, Warnick argues that Hitler's storytelling, which the Germans found possessed enough narrative fidelity to annihilate Jews, proves an inherent flaw in the narrative paradigm. Thus, narrative probability taken alone is inadequate for the criticism of rhetorical discourse. However, I disagree with this diversion of NPT. Just because a speaker is a talented orator and/or leader does not categorize their discourse as good. The values portion of NPT still ring true in the circumstances of the most evil narrative in human history. The story made sense to someone, and so they followed a wrong-headed story. In our critical reaction to theory, we must consider the relevance of values. Viewing human beings as storytellers who reason in various ways is a major conceptual shift. For example, in a logical system, values are emotional nonsense. From the narrative perspective, however, values are the stuff of stories. I will now show through my response to NPT in human communications how this theory was effective in contributing to the communication field through religious application of the theory. Communication for the glory of God is done through books of the Bible like Daniel, Esther, and Ruth, which are easy to recognize in the NPT model. But what about books of poetry and prose like Psalms or Song of Solomon, or prophetic tomes like Revelation and Isaiah? Still more, what about parables like in the Gospels? God tells one great fluent story through the anticipation, birth, work, death, and resurrection of his Son, Jesus Christ. And he tells us how to be ready for Christ's imminent return and how to recognize the time is near. Ephesians 5:15 and 16 says, "Look carefully then to how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days, they are evil." Finally, we will draw to a close with examples in literature and in life of the application of NPT. A concerned master's degree student at the University of Ottawa created her master's thesis based on the way current literature, like A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini, utilizes NPT to simplify the narratives of Afghan women who have lived for decades in war-torn oppression. Kazmian says, fictional narratives are another vivid source of information for readers, and in particular for those who do not have first-hand experience with Afghan women. Narrative has an implicit influence in the way people view the world, as well as shifting people's worldview. Yet one is left to wonder how popular fictional narratives represent Afghan women to the Western readers who rely on these outlets as the first-hand source of information. And the question remains that whether this sort of mass media device reproduces what the Western news media represents, or if it depicts Afghan women differently. One benefit of NPT is that one can take up nearly any work, including this presentation, and understand its narrative in order to decide whether or not the piece is rational, coherent, and has fidelity. In closing, we all can relate to NPT because everyone has a story. A good story is a powerful means of persuasion. As Fisher would remind us, almost all communication is narrative, and we evaluate it this way. According to his narrative paradigm, you can and will judge whether narratives you hear hang together and ring true to the values held by the people who make up your ideal audience. Thank you for your kind attention. This has been Amy Wright Payne for COM 403 Midterm Project.